muted. He's muted.
Muted. Oh, I see.
Okay, let us start the webinar. Good evening from Jakarta, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, members of the audience. Welcome back to the conference on Towards Open and Inclusive Regionalism. This conference is hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies Indonesia in cooperation with the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS, Japan, and the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, Singapore. This CSIS-GRIPS-RSIS conference is part of the Policy Research Network of Contemporary Southeast Asia, or PRN-SEA, a policy research network project by GRIPS Japan in collaboration with universities and research institutes in ASEAN. My name is Rocky and I will now continue to be your host for this two-day virtual event. Before we begin today's event, please allow me to warmly greet our panelists, especially Jusuf Wanandi, Vice Chairman, Board of Trustees of CSIS Foundation, and Ambassador Yutaka Iimura, Senior Fellow of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS, Japan. Without further ado, I would give the floor to our moderator for today, Dr. Lee Soo-hyun. Dr. Lee Soo-hyun is an assistant professor and coordinator of the MSc International Political Economy program at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. She received her PhD in political science at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Dr. Soo-hyun Lee primarily studies the issues of international and comparative political economy with a focus on trade, labor, and distributive and redistributive politics. Dr. Lee Soo-hyun, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rocky. Good evening, everyone. I am Soo-hyun Lee, Assistant Professor at RSIS NTU, and it is my honor and a great pleasure to serve as a moderator of the third session of the conference. We look forward to great discussions on the issues of economic cooperation and recovery. So let me start by introducing our great panelists. We have two speakers and two discussants. So I'd like to start by introducing Professor Jusuf Simanjuntak, who is a senior economist and the chair of the board of directors of the CSIS Foundation. He has been working on a wide array of issues, many in the field of international economics and macroeconomics. Our second speaker is Professor Fukunari Kimura, who has been serving as a chief economist, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia area, Jakarta, Indonesia, since 2008. And he has been also serving as a professor at the Faculty of Economics, Keio University, Tokyo, Japan, since 2000. We are also joined by two great discussants. Our first discussant is Dr. Narongchai Akrasani. He is an economist in Thailand and who is well known for his continuous involvement in the economic development of Thailand in many capacities, as well as in ASEAN and APEC affairs. He's serving as the chairman of steering committee and the vice chairman of Mekong Institute Council. And he's also the Thai Development Research Institute founding and board member. Last but not the least, we have a second discussant, Dr. Jeffrey Grash, who is a professor of international security studies at the College of International Security Affairs, National Defense University in Washington, D.C., and then his research primarily focused on maritime affairs. So I'd like to briefly remind you that each presentation of the speaker will last for 12 and then 15 minutes or so, and then we will move on to comments from the two discussants. So Dr. Jusuf Simanjuntak, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Greetings from Munich in Germany. I'm currently on vacation, but I was contacted last night on the need to jump in for Dr. Jose because of illness. I'm glad to do so. And I'm really happy to look old friends in you, like Iimura-san, Fukunari-san, and others. And later on also Narongchai Akrasane. The conditions we are facing with right now is really a very difficult one because of the war in Europe, governance rivalry between China and the United States, that also draws us from ASEAN, but also the need to somehow gradually end the huge stimulus program of the pandemic years. So we are in for a slowdown in the world economy. And the IMF has just issued an update on the World Economic Outlook yesterday. And projection was revised downward heavily in major economies. But ASEAN is quite an exception. And this is due to, I think, three major reasons. Number one, we in ASEAN are only indirectly and only mildly impacted by the conflict in Europe and the associated trade war, economic warfare. Number two is that we have in ASEAN resource-producing economies like Indonesia, the Philippines, and to some extent also Thailand, which benefit from the steep increases in commodity prices. And mind you, we need to remember that these steep increases in commodity prices are not exclusively related to the Russia-Ukrainian war, because prior to that war, we were already seeing prices going up, partly because of the ban of coal import from Australia to China. And the other important reason that helped insulate ASEAN from the current strong downturn, I think, is that we, ASEAN, can rely on 2 or 3 major economies in our neighbors that are also only marginally affected by the crisis in Europe. So we are in a better position than many economies in the world. And this implies also a responsibility on our side to do what we could do to help somehow mitigate the economic slowdown that is already taking place in other parts of the world. The question to us now is, given the more or less favorable conditions in ASEAN, and in my view also in China, Japan, and Korea, even though growth in China is projected to really fall down this year. But I think given the more or less favorable conditions, it is time for us in ASEAN and the rest of East Asia to think aloud about alternative measures that can protect us against possible severe effects of the conflicts in Europe. And I cannot think about anything else but deepening cooperation and integration among ourselves. Number one, it would mean, of course, if possible, accelerating the implementation of all the commitments we have made in many of the regional initiatives that we are part of. It applies to RCEP, CPTPP, and last but not least, in my view, a great deal also related to ASEAN. ASEAN will need to do something. We have overslept over the last few years. Hardly any new initiatives in ASEAN that are of great substance. Number two is, apart from this, accelerating existing mechanisms. I think we need to reinvent ourselves. East Asia. And we have exercised in this over the last decade. Narongchai Akrasane and Fukunari-san were involved in the so-called CPA-SEPA initiative. Before that, we have the exercise in form of ASEAN +3 initiative. So deepening cooperation and integration among ASEAN +3, probably that should be our priority right now. ASEAN +3 is, in my view, the most realistic option that I can think of while responding to the very difficult global conditions and the very difficult impacts that may come from the crisis in Europe. And I can think of a number of things. Number one, of course, is deepening and probable expansion of the Chiang Mai initiative, multilateralized. We can somehow also address fiscal policies in those forums. I can think of, for instance, concerted stimulus within ASEAN +3, in which countries with relatively favorable resource position can continue to stimulate the economies, of course, cautiously doing so because of the threat of inflation. That's number one. Once again, deepening and widening of the Chiang Mai initiative. Number two is the activation of what we call strategic reserves in ASEAN. Long ago, we agreed on strategic oil reserves. We also agreed on strategic food reserves. And both, in my view, are now high in demand because of the food, the probable food crisis and energy crisis. And of course, also we can think of strengthening our ASEAN +3 cooperation by extending it to technology cooperation. We have done very little in this. Now that Japan, Korea, and China are there as leading technology economies in the world, I think it's time for us in East Asia to really think about technology cooperation in our part of the world as they do in Europe. And we can add to that, of course, I call it second best policy, the most realistic of all options that is open to us right now, but we need to keep it open. Another possible area also under the second best initiative, of course, is ASEAN Travel Corridor. Narong Chai can talk about this more. We are all now a major player in regional tourism, and I think this kind of program can really help to stimulate tourism economy in our part of the world. Another possible area is East Asia energy communities. However gradual, we have the resources in our part of the world, but how to make the best use of the resources, I think requires a very close cooperation in the region. Next, please. I still think about the importance of India under the current global conditions. So probably we can float the idea of economic summit. And if ASEAN +6 is too difficult, we probably can concentrate our effort on ASEAN +3 economic summit. Summit that is really designed to address important economic issues. My last slide, please. Last slide. Is that all? Yeah, the last slide was about leadership. Nothing will happen unless there is leader who help move things forward. And Indonesia happens to be the chair of ASEAN next year. And I think given that Indonesia is this year's chair of president of G20, I think without much difficulties, Indonesia can make use of its leadership in bringing first ASEAN economies together, and of course ASEAN economies with the other three major external dialogue partners of ASEAN. I mentioned in one of my slides the importance of benefaction strategy. Benefaction strategy in favor of resolving the Myanmar issues. I know very little about this, but ASEAN without a solution to the Myanmar problems will remain a very handicapped regional cooperation initiative. So probably we can extend to Myanmar certain forms of benefaction to help move things forward in that part of ASEAN. Dr. Lee, that much I can share in this meeting, and I hope I have floated a number of new issues that we can talk about later in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Jusuf Simanjuntak. It was a great analysis about why ASEAN countries have been relatively away, from the adverse shocks from the global economy and the war in Ukraine, and with a constructive suggestions, for regional cooperation and integration. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our second presentation by Professor Fukunari Kimura. Professor Kimura, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be here. Thank you very much. I have a slide. Am I supposed to share it from here or from organizer? Either way is fine, but maybe I better do it from my side. Can I do that? So can you see my slide? Is it okay?
Yes, everything's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. The session title is Economic Cooperation and Recovery. So I pick up the recovery side. Basically, my initial talk is in threefold. One, I like to talk about what happened in supply chains or international production networks, particularly in East Asia during COVID-19. We had many really pessimistic views initially, and some people claimed that the global value chains would be dead, and then globalization would be dead. So actually, ASEAN and East Asia have utilized globalization forces very effectively for economic development. So what happened on global value chains or supply chains or international production networks? I like to claim that production networks survived very strongly through COVID-19. So of course, we had many issues. That was a really hardship, but overall, that survived very strongly. The second, the commitment level of ASEAN and East Asia on production networks. I like to claim that we are really committing to international production networks very strongly, particularly in the case of ASEAN. If we think of the economic size and others, the commitment level is very high. So I think it's very important to commit to those kind of international division of labor very strongly from now on too. The third portion, I like to talk about what would happen from here. So I like to claim that the ASEAN and East Asia should continuously commit to globalization forces for economic development. But we are having some difficulties now. One challenge is geopolitical tensions. And the second is much more short run the difficulties, including many issues, resource, energy prices, food prices, and also some instability in macroeconomic issues and others. So those are what I like to talk about as an initial talk. So the first one, supply chain survived COVID-19. That's what I like to claim. ASEAN and East Asia quickly overcame two negative shocks coming from COVID-19 in 2020. One was negative supply shocks came from upstream. Initially from China. China had the first lockdown in January, February, and we had a shortage of parts and components and the finished products coming from China. But that shock overall was overcome relatively quickly. And also, we were afraid of negative demand shocks coming from worldwide recession. But it didn't happen so severely because many countries, particularly developed countries, committed themselves to conduct very strong mitigation policies. So the negative demand shocks were relatively small. And particularly international production networks in East Asia, that is the sophisticated portion of global value chains, proved to be robust and resilient. Actually, we observed the same thing in the past crises, including Asian currency crisis, global financial crisis, East Japan earthquake, and Thailand's flooding. So the production networks were robust and resilient And this time again, they were proved to be robust and resilient. So, and also ASEAN and East Asia aggressively took advantage of positive demand shocks. Actually, we had positive demand shocks due to work at home, stay home type products, including personal computers, displays, computer chairs, for example, and sometimes something related to work at home, stay home type, say dishwashers or the electric hand drills. Those are having positive demand shocks. East Asia utilized positive demand shocks very strongly too. Earlier conducted a questionnaire survey for corporate firms in ASEAN 10 and India. We got about 2,000 replies. Surprisingly, many firms located in ASEAN and India conducted reshuffling of supply chains very aggressively, upstream and downstream. And more than half of the replies tell us that they are gaining positive profits even in year 2020. Of course, we can see some sort of sample biases because that was conducted through internet, but we can see a sort of dynamism in Asian firms over there. So still multiple infection peaks are coming, but ASEAN and East Asia can continue to utilize globalization forces for economic development. So I think the sentiment is quite different from other parts of the world, particularly in the EU. They are really inward-looking thought right now. So some figures are coming from IMF's World Economic Outlook. This is actually the former version, April version. You can see in figure 4.1, this is trade in goods, trade in services, what would happen. Trade in goods, this is a blue line. So coming down in the first quarter and the second quarter in 2020 and bounce back like that. So relatively quickly, that is coming back. Trade and services are having a deeper trough, and then after that, not really recovering a lot. So you can see the disaggregation of services trade in figure 4.3. The travel, tourism are having a really hard time, but some are not really much. And particularly in this case, telecommunications are having some positive growth. You can see the figure 4.2. This is the summation of goods trade and also services trade. So in case of COVID shock, this is a green line, sharp drop, but the sharp recovery as a whole. So in case of a global financial crisis, actually slow coming down, but the trough was very wide. So that indicates that in global financial crisis, we had negative demand shocks very strongly. This time, that effects were not very strong. So some services sector like computer services, they are growing in 2020. This is exports of computer services. Then, of course, the denominator was small, so that's why the growth rates were very high. But you can see many countries having a positive growth in exports of computer services. If you just look at machinery industries, this is what I call international production networks, because that is doing part by part international division of labor, or in Richard Baldwin's word, second unbundling. Say blue line, those are general and electric machinery. Red line, transport equipment. Then green line, this is a precision machinery. So we had a trough in the first half of 2020, and particularly in transport equipment, trough was very deep, but coming back by, say, September or October of 2020. And after that, actually not really easy to having a really strong growth, but so we can see some sort of recovery over there. So in case of East Asia, compared with North America or Europe, actually the trough was very, very minimal in the case of general electrical machinery. This is a blue line, light blue line. Even in the case of transport equipment, trough was much shallower than the rest of the world. So we can see that the recovery was quicker in East Asia, trough was shallower too. And then the dominance of factory Asia was even strengthened through COVID-19. So the second thing, machinery production networks in ASEAN and also India. I like to claim that ASEAN member states' commitment to IPN is very strong. I conducted some gravity equation exercise. I will show you some figures from here. But after controlling the country size, distance, and others, intra-ASEAN and ASEAN Northeast Asia links are very strong compared with other parts of the world. And then ASEAN member states start constructing intra-ASEAN production networks too. So some people are worrying about the low intra-ASEAN trade ratios, but in case of machinery production networks, actually we observe the formation of intra-ASEAN production networks. And also, I like to claim that ASEAN is at the center of factory Asia. Quantitatively, China is big, but the commitment level to production networks is even stronger in ASEAN. So we will have US-China confrontation, geopolitical tension. Those are really bad, but that may rather strengthen the importance of ASEAN in factory Asia. To keep the rule-based trading regime is the key, because I say geopolitical tension jeopardizes the rule-based trading regime. So they utilize AEC, CPTPP, and RCEP as living and evolving agreements. This is going to be very, very important. And also India has a lot of room for linking with ASEAN-centered production networks. So this is a trade matrix before COVID-19, 2019. So rows are exporters, columns are importers. Then we can see actual values over there in A. Then we have predicted values coming from gravity equation utilizing 160 countries data. So then A divided by B, that is a ratio of actual values divided by predicted values. So predicted values are sort of world standard values. So you can see ASEAN all are way above 100, so even 200. So that means that thinking of the country size of ASEAN member states and also distance, ASEAN is really doing machinery exports and also imports a lot. So in case of China, so certainly actual export figures are big, but the commitment level, say A divided by B is much smaller. So even in the case of China's exports to Japan, exports to Korea, these are less than 100%. So China is big. That is why China is exporting a lot. And also the link between ASEAN and the CJK, those are very, very thick too. So this indicates that ASEAN is really doing a central role in international production networks in East Asia. So in case of India, those are very disappointing. You can see A divided by B, particularly in the export side, very, 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 very small. Import side, some, because they are doing a sort of import substituting type operations over there. So this is ASEAN member states things are coming from the same estimates. So some countries are having a very tight connection with some specific countries, but in case of Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, they are really connecting to almost all ASEAN member states. In case of Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, still sort of really big figures and small figures, depending on member states. But those figures are really increasing. So we can see the emergence of ASEAN international production networks. So Indonesia was also in export side, export to the Philippines and Vietnam, those are big. Import side, Singapore, of course, but in case of Thailand and Vietnam, big. So this is mainly from automobile industry. So still electric machinery link is not very, very high. Okay, the third point, what's next? So I like to claim that ASEAN and East Asia can continue to take advantage of the international production networks and believes in the globalization forces for economic development. However, we are having some challenges. One, geopolitical tensions. You know that the scope of geopolitical tensions has expanded, starting from relatively simplistic trade issues at tariff war to competition over technologies and hegemony of superpowers, then expanding to human rights issues and democracy. So actually, the political debate is very heated in G7 countries, including Japan. Actually, nobody is really talking about the freer trade, freer investment, believing globalization right now. Pascal Lamy and Cora Suzuki wrote a small article in Foreign Affairs in June. Actually, they claim that now we are having a really heated political discussion, but at the same time, economies are moving very actively. So we had a really sort of separation of political discussion and economic reality. So if we think of that calmly, then it's very likely that we would have just a partial decoupling of supply chains rather than total decoupling. So actually, the U.S. exports to China, even in the case of semiconductor, increased in year 2020 and 21. Japan's exports to China, in case of electric machinery, also increasing in 2021. So economies are moving. At the same time, some part of the economy, particularly something related to sensitive technologies and rare earth metal, we are having some decoupling. So I think the partial decoupling of supply chains seems inevitable. So what to do? Developed countries must define trade investment controls as clearly as possible and reduce uncertainty for private activities. And the rest of the economy should be put under the rule-based trading regime. I think we have to say this very loudly because this kind of voice is very small now in G7. And also third countries, including ASEAN, must try to rely on the rule-based trading regime continuously. But at the same time, some preparation may be needed to take care of geopolitical tensions. For example, extraterritoriality for some products using US technology and the software, for example. US regulation is having extraterritoriality. So even in firms located in ASEAN under this kind of restriction. And also forced labor issues, those are going to be legalized in EU and also the US. So the ASEAN also should be very careful not to having some backlash coming from there. So I think some preparation may be needed for geopolitical tensions, even in the case of ASEAN. So RTAs must be utilized by reduce policy risks and defend the rule-based trading regime. And also in the short run, we are having a sort of threat of possible instability in the world economy, food and energy prices. Pak Jisman talked about some positive aspects possibly for resource prices. But inflation would be a problem for some countries too. And also higher interest rates and macroeconomic instability. And some people are claiming a worldwide recession. So we have to watch very carefully in the short run. Today, I did not talk about much on the digital transformation and green growth. This is a little bit in a longer perspective, but those are very key issues in ASEAN and East Asia too. So in the last page, references. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kimura. I was impressed, by your thorough analysis of, trade data. And then, as we might all know, there have been a lot of, pessimistic, prospects, from the, national economic organizations, like the IMF assessed that the global recession, could be at hand soon. And then given that, it is quite reassuring and interesting to learn that the global supply chains, remain robust despite the, geopolitical tensions and the COVID-19 pandemic, and that ASEAN and East Asia are still able to utilize globalization further development. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our discussant. I'd like to invite Dr. Narongchai Akrasani, and then he will comment on the first presentation by Professor Jusuf Wanandi. Thank you. Dr. Akrasani, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. The connection is okay. You can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you very clearly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for this opportunity to speak among friends, some new ones, some old ones. I'm very happy to do so. I would like to make comments on both speakers. Actually, I'm supposed to be discussant, but Rocky has given me assignment, to do certain things. But nevertheless, those assignments are in line with the presentations by the two speakers. So I will be responding to both of them. My first impression that we are economists, we are economic science, we are supposed to be dismal science. But both speakers seem to be more positive, much more than the political scientists speaking this morning. This morning sessions were very, very difficult, very tough, a lot of challenging stories. Anyway, on our part, I like to organize my discussion in three parts. The first is the current challenges. This is basically responding to Rocky's request. I will make, that's the first one. I will make three parts. This one is current challenges. On the current challenges, I think there are four of them. Number one, slow growth. Big challenge to all of us all over the world, whole world, including ASEAN. Although this man may be saying that we're not that badly affected, but all of us, we have slow growth and slow recovery due to first, uncertainties, all kinds of uncertainties relating to COVID pandemic or endemic management. Mainly because we don't know what's going on. We have to change policy, we have to do things to respond to changes. And that affects a lot about employment. I mean, a lot of people don't come back to work. It's happening everywhere. We have unemployment, but people don't come back to work, even if they're asked to. I mean, not enough anyway. So recovery is very difficult. And another part, because of the slow growth, is the need to control inflation. the need to control inflation by raising policy interest rates. We are seeing that now. The US, the Fed, all of us know, in June, up to 1.75 and rising. EU Bank, European Union Bank, almost positive now. And they committed to raising up to 0.75 by the end of the year. So definitely we would have slow growth because of these uncertainties and high interest rate. Second, inflation. This inflation resulting from QE policies. We recall that US, Europe, even Japan and so on, using this QE policy. Now they are tightening. They call it quality tightening, quantity tightening. And that affect when they had the QE policies, lots of money supply came into the world. We all recognize that. But now they are tightening. They're tightening this QE policies to respond to inflation. Nonetheless, inflation has already started because of the huge money supply, and also the supply chain disruption. Although we do not really have the disaster in the so-called global supply chain, but we all accept the fact that there has been disruption in supply chain, particularly last year, when chips are not available to be used for a lot of things, and shipping cost, freight rate, still very high. So those are contributing to inflation. Of course, now we have more, because of the crisis in Europe. Third point, first, slow growth, second, inflation, third, high interest rate. We are entering a period of high interest rate. As I mentioned before, the Fed and European Union Bank already raised their policy rate. And with high interest rate, we also going to have this liquidity problem, international liquidity, because of the capital flow going back to the advanced economies. The Fed now is reducing or tightening. Each period is amounting to something like 47.5 billion. And this will go up to 95 billion from September. 95 billion, that's a lot of money draining liquidity out of the whole financial system. Number 4, high prices of oil and gas, and therefore energy, and including energy. Due to first, even before Ukraine-Russia problem, the attempt to reduce fossil fuel usage. We read about the closing of coal factories, mining, and reducing the investment in fossil fuel and so on. So with the problem in Europe, lots of things could not come back to where it was before. And therefore the high oil price, high LNG price, it's going to stay high very long. And that will affect the cost of electricity in the power production. And this Ukraine-Russian, made everything worse and would reconfigure the whole so-called distribution structure of oil and gas. This man was right that we were not that much affected by the crisis in Europe, but I don't think we can deny that all of us are affected. So this is the challenges facing all of us, different degree, some more, some less, depending upon what they are. Now I move on to my second part. What can the countries do? What can the country do? I like to organize this one into 2 parts. What can the country do? One would be what can ASEAN do? And the other, what can ASEAN and the so-called dialogue partners together? ASEAN, of course, we have to keep to promote growth, but we are now limited by fiscal and monetary space because for the last 2 years, we use a lot of money already from finance, from fiscal spending, and from also monetary assistance. So spaces are limited, but we still have to continue to do that, definitely. Number 2, we have to manage inflation by raising interest rate. We have to do that, all of us. Already we are starting. and managing price movement, including currency depreciation. Currency depreciation. You notice, all of us notice that we are now having depreciation in our currency compared to the US dollar. Number three, how much we can do depends a lot on what, our foreign exchange we have. Some have pretty good foreign exchange. I looked at the statistics up to May. Countries like Singapore will be fine. Thailand is still okay. But some of the other ASEAN countries, they are in the so-called 100 billion US dollar category. Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia. And some are really suffering. Laos, PDR, Myanmar, Cambodia. They are really suffering because they've got no foreign exchange left. So very little that they can do, and we are now feeling that the Sri Lanka problem may have appear in some of our ASEAN member countries. That's a limitation we can do. Now, most of us, nonetheless, most of us can expect to recover to the GDP level. I looked at the IMF prediction. I think practically, except those countries that I just mentioned, we could go back to the level of production in 2019, Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam. But Thailand, perhaps we could not, because of our reliance, our dependence on tourism sector too much. And we could not get that many tourists coming back. And another one, I agree with Kimura-san, that we could exploit this new international production network because of the movement of some production out of China into Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and so on, and with India involving in the process. That we can do definitely. So those are some of the things that the ASEAN countries can do together or by ourselves. And the next one is about then what would be the dialogue partners? What can ASEAN and dialogue partners can do? Here, the least that I can hope for, maybe the most that I can hope for, is for them to help reduce uncertainties. We listened this morning about a lot of problems creating uncertainties. I give just one example. This is my wish list. I know it will not happen because it's all about the way the leaders behave, the rivalry among the leaders, the ego of the leader, not the people like us. Now, what I hope, for example, with the US to move some of the aircraft carriers. Now we have 12 aircraft carriers of the US in our ocean, Pacific Ocean. If they could remove some of them out, that would help. I don't know why they have to have 12 of them, and each cost $12 billion US. Why floating all the carriers in our water? Number two, I hope China to work with ASEAN on the South China Sea issue, the Code of Conduct thing, and on this ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. We heard this morning that last November, China already accepted this idea of ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific because it is inclusive, not exclusive like other version of invented by the US and so on. But even this morning when we talked about it, English version according to Keng Yong include Indo-Pacific, but somebody said in the Chinese version did not include the phrase Indo-Pacific. So I don't know, but anyway, I hope China would work with us on that. And for China and US, I hope. Please help, get the Russia and Ukraine to come to negotiation. But I know this is what will happen, but only my hope. Now, finally, can we rely on cooperation scheme to help? Now, we have a number of cooperation schemes. I think for ASEAN, yes. And this one mentioned this Chiang Mai initiative, mentioned the pooling of reserve. I think reserve is going to be very, very crucial for all of us. So we have to rely, on each other, helping each other about the research situation. Singapore, Thailand have much more than others, but the rest, we need to help. So initiative like this research that this man said, yes. And now if you look at what ASEAN has been doing for the last 2 years during this COVID period, excuse me. Maybe I have COVID now. I use this spray. We have many schemes which have been introduced. ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, more active products out of the non-tariff barrier list is another achievement. ASEAN Travel Corridor Arrangement Framework. And from this year, March 2022, upgrading our ATIGA. Plus some of the things that ASEAN did with others. ASEAN had the summit with the US in May 2022 and pledged on trade and investment cooperation and promotion, plus connectivity. Then, of course, we have starting this year, ASEP from January, effective in 10 countries already, that can be relied upon. We have ASEAN countries in the CPTPP. We have four countries there: Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, and so on. Some of the CPTPP measures are useful. Finally, of course, we have ASEAN in APEC, and Thailand is now hosting APEC this year. So we try very, very hard to get some of these APEC member countries to come and talk, to work together. We thought that we have created this platform for cooperation, but what we are seeing, what we have been observing at some of the trade minister meeting, finance minister meeting, and so on, instead of using this platform for cooperation, some of them are using this platform for rivalry and competition and even fighting. That's unfortunate, but I hope by November, when Thailand is hosting this APEC, 18 and 19 November, I hope some senses come back and they can, try to at least cooperate on economic matters. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akrasani. I would say it is a quite accurate descriptions about the nature of the challenges and uncertainties we are currently facing, including slow growth and the global supply disruptions and then rising inflation. Your suggestions for policy implementation with an emphasis on regional cooperation and the multilateral existing institutions are also very meaningful. So now I'd like to invite our second discussant, Professor Geoffrey Grash. Professor Grash, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and congratulations on the launch of a very successful few days of discussions. It's a real honor to be here. I greatly enjoyed and applaud the discussion thus far, and the presentations were very rich in details. I'm going to take a play out of my colleague here and perhaps make some general overarching questions that I very much look forward to possible further discussion and answers related therein. I have around 6 points that I wanted to throw out there for further elaboration. The first has to do with infrastructure. The second has to do with energy security. The third, of course, we've talked about trade with China and the like, but I'd be curious to dig in further on specifically Taiwan and ASEAN. The fourth is related to how the EU can be better integrated in. And the fifth, green economy, and the sixth, blue economy. And so as you can see, kind of the overarching discussion here, what's of interest to me to kind of dig into further, it very much circles around economic cooperation. What are the avenues and venues that ASEAN plus other powers, to include the United States, can be involved? The first I think about is very much infrastructure. As you know, by some estimates, by the year 2040, there'll be $94 trillion that will be spent globally on infrastructure. In Asia alone, there will be around $26.3 trillion that will be spent by 2030. The United States, of course, has thought about this, but hasn't fully succeeded in how and the mechanisms and vehicles to do that. Certainly, we know at the G7 meeting in June of 2021 was the adoption of the Build Back Better world under the influence of the President Biden administration. And this subsumed the Blue Dot Network, which really never took off significantly. And furthermore, the United States is really in fits and starts, doesn't have a clear coordinating body by some estimates at the NSC, for example, to oversee such banks as the Exim Bank, the International Development Finance Corporation, the U.S. Trade Agency, and the like. And so this is, an area for ripe opportunity, I think, for the United States, which hasn't always been as directly engaged. But nevertheless, the International Development Finance Corporation is still getting its bearings straight, having only been just kind of repurposed in 2019. But its funding is only around $60 billion, and the hope is to increase to $100 billion. So I think there's potential in the realm of infrastructure. I'd be curious to get the speakers' further thoughts on possible venues or opportunities for greater cooperation in that realm, because I think there can be huge positive spillover effects. The second, and my colleague spoke a bit about the importance of energy security and energy flows. I think it would be interesting to talk some more about that, especially if there is a continued prolongation of a war in Europe related to Russia. Certainly, this is really adverse effects. The third point, again, to go back to Taiwan specifically, about how ASEAN is thinking, individual nations are thinking about bilateral trade avenues, and furthermore, as Professor Fukunari rightfully and in depth talked about the geopolitical tensions. And as we know, unfortunately, in Washington these days, there is very much this kind of air of a certain crisis brewing with Speaker Pelosi's forthcoming visit to Taiwan. And that, again, has real implications for the region. The fourth point is, and this is more, I guess, related to Dr. Jisman, related on the discussion of ASEAN, +3, +6. But I'd be curious to hear about how the EU, especially, thinking about the cooperation that can ensue as Europe sort of struggles on the geopolitical side related to Russia, how ASEAN could be another venue to further elaborate upon. The fourth relates to green economy and how this can be another avenue, and we can lump it together with the blue economy. And countries have tackled this in varying degrees of success, but I think it's a possible outlet and opportunity for growth, for economic cooperation, where many countries can very much benefit from both the green technology, shared information in that space, but also blue economy of, and of course, a lot of it ties back to energy security too, and how we leverage the power of the ocean from an energy standpoint, but also from a food security standpoint too. So with that, I'll leave it. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here, and I very much look forward to the follow-on discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Grash. I'd like to say that, that was a complete set with the overarching questions, that could be applied, to presentations simultaneously. And specifically, I agree with you that it'd be very important to think about the different natures of the issue area, including infrastructure, energy security, trade, and then extended in a cooperation with the EU, and also the importance of the green and the blue economies. So we will be moved into, the discussion among panelists in the first, which will be followed by a Q&A session with the general audience. So I think we can utilize this chance to, connect some dots, across the different presentations and then comments. So first of all, I wonder if, our speakers, whether our speakers have any responses, to comment from discussion. Maybe, may I invite, Professor Jusuf and then Professor Kimura, respectively?
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly. Thank you.
Yes, to Narongchai, I think we almost totally agree with one another on the on how the economies are progressing right now. I agree with him when he said that somehow we have to get ourselves prepared for a deterioration in our economic conditions. There is a time lag, of course, between the crisis in Europe and the impacts on the rest of the world, particularly on us in East Asia and in ASEAN. Number two, on infrastructure financing, Jeffrey's point, we are going to see greater difficulties indeed, as the financial system is being, I would say, overstretched right now. As Narongchai pointed, we are seeing governments distancing themselves slowly from the huge stimulus packages that they deployed during the last 3 years or so. Financial market is going to be tightening, in my view, and because of that, of course, infrastructure financing also facing the same problems. But perhaps we should look closer into some other regional banks, such as the AIIB of China, and probably also Asian development banks. And there are a lot of opportunities there for resource pooling. But of course, it involves also some geopolitical factors. Number three, relation with Taiwan. Let me refrain from commenting on this, but somehow I think sooner or later, US will have to accept the reality that Taiwan is part of China. ASEAN plus three, ASEAN EU relation. This has always been a very difficult relation. I was once chairing the ASEAN EU expert group on exploring cooperation between the two sides, but some issues are really hampering us from proceeding further, like issues of palm oil, green economy, issues of fishery, and the like. And given the conditions in Europe now, it's going to be very difficult to get anything of meaning in the relation between ASEAN and EU. Green economy, I agree. And this is one of the things I have in mind when I discuss this East Asia energy community. We know that China, Japan, and Korea have made huge progress in renewable energy in terms of mastering of technologies and allowing these technologies flowing to other parts of East Asia, I think, would create huge growth opportunities. But to allow these technologies to flow freer to other parts of East Asia, I think require not just trade cooperation, but also other forms of cooperation like technical cooperation as well as development financing cooperation. But I think with what is happening right now in the energy market, we are going to see a kind of a slowdown in the transition to renewable energy from fossil energy. Even coal perhaps is going to be rediscovered in some countries, including Europe. But I would say there is no need to throw overboard the commitment made to this transition in energy transition. What is likely to happen is just a slowdown in the process of the transition, but it will have to continue. Countries have made commitment to do so, and I think credibility is at stake if we just throw the ideas overboard right now. And I think G20 is going to elevate energy transition to the top of its communique next time in Jakarta. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jusuf. And then now, may I invite Professor Kimura to respond to comments from discussants?
Yeah, thank you very much. For Dr. Naronchai, I think he pointed out a bunch of very important things, particularly in the short run and middle run, and I all agree on that. Those are very, very important issues. And also he emphasized what can we do, particularly say a corporate scheme to work at the end of his talk. I think those are very, very important. So from the viewpoint of Japan, maybe now a sort of political discussion is really heated. And then actually looking at ASEAN, and ASEAN is a sort of good for coming back to reality, actually. So political discussion is a sort of abstract in a sense. So they forget that the economy is moving, actually. So I think now the discussion on the agenda setting for IPEF just started. I don't know the contents of the meeting, but they had a meeting yesterday, I think, online. I think by facing ASEAN, so I think Japanese can look at the sort of reality. So certainly geopolitical tensions are very important, and we have to have so-called economic security issues very seriously. That's very important too. But at the same time, economy is moving, and it's in ASEAN particularly is the ASEAN's economy is very dynamic. I think that we cannot really forget those kind of very important issues. So I think the talk on IPEF hopefully may make say political leaders to go back to the reality at the same time. So security issues are important, but at the same time, economic realities are going on. So we have to have a sort of good balance between these two. So the discussion on security issues, yeah, sometimes discussions are very all or nothing. They do not have a sort of sense of trade-off. So we need both, right? So security and economy. So I think we have to go back to that kind of really basic discussion in the case of Japan these days, I think so. So yeah, for Jeffrey's comments, so he pointed out 6 very important issues. All are certainly very important. So I think you mentioned infrastructure investment demand. I'm a bit wondering whether those kind of estimates are really taking care of sort of infrastructure development in the past 10, 20 years. 20 years ago or 15 years ago, that was very obvious that the hardware infrastructure was in shortage in ASEAN, in many countries actually. But in the past, I think 10, 15 years, they did a lot. So particularly in ASEAN forerunners, I think a big infrastructure construction is not a kind of really major issue. Of course, urban transport and others are still going on and spending a lot of money on that, of course. But talking about some basic roads and ports and others, so I think a lot of improvement in the 10, 15 years. So, and also the ability of collecting taxes, particularly domestic taxes, those are going to be better too. So if you look at the sort of fiscal situation in many countries, I think it's pretty stable. So even still in the case of the Philippines, for example, the size of the government budget out of GDP was maybe too low. But in many member states, I think the situation improved a lot in the past decade or so. So maybe we have to reconsider, I think, a sort of really rough, big figure on a sort of infrastructure demand over there. Energy green issues, certainly that's an extremely important issue. And then, so the situation of ASEAN member states is quite different country by country. Some are slightly exporting, actually, then many are importing. The structure of primary energy resources are quite different. Still, Indonesia, together with China and India, is using coal substantially. But other countries are not really using coal much. So in case of Thailand, predominantly natural gas. I think it really depends on the country what sort of primary energy sources are used. And also for these countries, if say Europeans would say that so fossil fuels should be banned at the end, so say ASEAN cannot do immediately. So I think economic development is a prime goal for them. We have to respect for that. By having that, we have to have some good optimal path to going to zero emission by 2050 or 60. So that's what ASEAN is heading for. And they are very serious about thinking of that now, I think. So not really going to a sort of really extreme, even if we do not have any scheme, but we have to have some sort of good planning, really reducing a sort of emission step by step and changing a sort of structure of energy sources and others. So I think so that's a big issue, and also a lot of room for cooperation, particularly in the technical cooperation with Japan and the US too. Yeah, and also Taiwan's issues, that's very sensitive. But so in economic figure, Taiwan is a big one for ASEAN too. Actually, so they are so the trade with us, Taiwan is really sort of really essential things, including semiconductors and others. And also, they are doing outward foreign direct investment in ASEAN a lot too. And those are sometimes small, medium enterprises, but that's a sort of core part of industrial agglomeration in many ASEAN member countries. So I think the existence of Taiwan is very important economically. But politically, it's certainly very sensitive. So I think ASEAN is very cautious about that too. So EU involvements, but ASEAN as a whole, as you know, that we have some political problem in Myanmar and maybe Cambodia too. So EU is hesitating. Sort of picking up ASEAN as a whole as a sort of counterpart so far. That's what I understand. But in the bilateral trade agreements, they are doing a negotiation with Indonesia and others too. So I think that's sort of their stance at this moment, particularly for trade agreements. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kimura. That was quite a comprehensive response to the points raised by our discussant. So may I ask Professor Grash and then Dr. Akrasani if you have any further comments on the responses from speakers? Other than that, I think we are ready to move on the extended discussion with other panelists and also a Q&A session. Actually, I wanted to invite, Professor Shinoda. He has addressed 3 specific questions in the Q&A. I can read the questions, for everybody, but Professor Shinoda, may I invite you to address your 3 questions once again?
Thank you very much. Okay, I have 3 questions, as is mentioned in the chat box. And the first point is regional economic integration is one of the pillar initiatives for economic cooperation and recovery in Asia, with RCEP entering into force in 2022 and CPTPP in the process of expanding its membership. How will the mega FTAs in the region be expanded and deepened in the future? And the second question is, how should the IPEF, in which the US has taken initiative, be expanded to include more countries? And how should we further proceed with rule making and cooperation under the IPEF? And my third question is, now that India has withdrawn from the RCEP negotiations, what kind of regional economic architecture is needed to connect India more deeply into the Asian industrial supply chain? What are the chances of India joining RCEP or CPTPP in the future? Thank you.
Okay, so now Professor Shinoda has addressed 3 different questions. One is the importance of the regional or mega free trade agreement. He wants to know about your views and perspectives about the future of the rise of mega FTAs. And the second question was about the IPEF, where the US has taken initiative, whether it will be expanded to include more countries, and then how should they further proceed with rural development and cooperation under the IPEF. And the third one, actually, I wanted to ask the same question. This is about the India. What do you think about the possibility that ASEAN deepen cooperation with India? And then what kind of a framework are we thinking about? So may I open the floor and then hear from our speakers and discussant?
May I?
Sure, of course.
Professor
Jusuf.
I would argue for focusing attention to what we have now in place in terms of regional integration, focusing on RCEP, CPTPP, where a number of ASEAN countries are member, and of course also ASEAN proper, deepening ASEAN integration. Yeah, there is a lot that we can do there. Rather than exploring new initiatives such as IPEF. It may be, it may have good prospect in the future, but given the current conditions facing us, I would really argue in favor of focusing our attention to strengthen what we have. Number two, India. We cannot put India aside in the discussion of regional integration in the region. Yes, we know that there is problem in regard to ASEAN, but India is going to continue to grow, to play a much more important role in the economies of the region in the years to come. India is also a strong force in science and technology, and on which we are bound to depend more and more in the future. So even though India is excluded right now for ASEAN, attempts should be made to really invite them continuously. And who knows, changes in government and ministers in India and can provide a better environment for India to re-enter ASEAN. But once again, I would underline, we should not underestimate the importance of India being part of the regional development in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jusman. Professor Kimura or discussions.
May I?
Sure. Yeah, Professor Krasani.
Yes.
Yeah.
I want to support what Jusman just said. Number one, definitely, I think this is the idea of IPEF and so on, just spoiling everything, wasting time. We should not pay attention to that. According to me, we should pay much more attention to what we have, strengthening what we have done. We have spent so much time negotiating on ASEP. And the CPTPP coming back, and we may want to go enjoy that. Lots of works have already been done, so we should work on those. Okay, that's number one. Now, number two, I have the same view with Jusman on India. I think the best way to accommodate, to involve India is by letting the market forces to work, because this is what's happening. The Indian business people are working according to market forces. And this IPN, as explained to us by Kimura earlier, is all by private sector, by market forces. But if you want to negotiate with India, I've done that before, on any scheme, on agreement, on official agreement, you will talk with Indian bureaucrats. The Indian bureaucrats are impossible to talk to. Impossible to get agreement upon, regardless of whatever policy government tells them. So let's not get India involved. This is the reason why when we adopted ASEP this year, I proposed that before, it should be ASEP -1, meaning ASEP minus India. Like we used to have this concept in ASEAN minus whatever. Eventually, India will come along, but even if it's not in the ASEP, they will be active in the cooperation in the network anyway. So that's my views on India and ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Akrasani. Now I see Ambassador Iimura raised his hands. Ambassador Iimura, yeah, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to ask a question regarding China's position on AOIP, which Dr. Naronchai talked about just some minutes ago. He referred to the discussion that we had during the first session, and he mentioned that China came up supporting AOIP for the first time in November last year. That was what we actually discussed this morning. But at that time, on the other hand, in Chinese translation of the sentence supporting AOIP, it did not mention Indo-Pacific. So it mentioned only ASEAN's outlook. So at that moment, China's position regarding AOIP was not so clear. But now, yesterday, after the talks with President Xi Jinping, both Indonesian and Chinese president came out with joint press statement, which I quote just briefly. This is very interesting sentence, and also I guess I hope this is new development in terms of China's position regarding AOIP. They mentioned that both sides will promote mutually beneficial cooperation between ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific and BRI, as well as promote collaboration of the GDI, which is, I think, abbreviation of Global Development Initiative that Chinese have been advocating for some time. GDI key areas and AOIP's priority areas, which is, I think, 4 pillars of AOIP initiatives. And then they said contributing to the implementation of the AOIP. So this is a step further from the position Chinese took in November last year. Chinese seems to be at least reading this communique, press statement. Chinese is ready to discuss concrete content of collaboration between ASEAN and China. This is just my pure guess. But then from here, my question is, first, how do you evaluate China's new position in terms of framing the regional development cooperation in future? That is first question. And second, regarding this sentence, I think there will be 2 ways for ASEAN countries to respond. One is, okay, you agree with us, then let's discuss about it within the framework of ASEAN +3. This is one way for ASEAN to respond. Then second way, another way is, okay, that's a good idea for Chinese to take. Then let us discuss about it in a concrete manner in East Asia Summit process, then which includes naturally United States and other countries. I think there are 2 ways, and even toward the end of this month or early next month, you'll be having this East Asia Summit processes summit, and also ASEAN +3 summit, and maybe you'll be obliged or expected to respond to this Chinese new tone regarding AOIP. So if someone can enlighten me on this question, I will be very happy.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Iimura. So may I ask, whether our speakers or discussant, can comment on the changing stance of China in regional cooperation with ASEAN and its, institutional framework?
Even a personal intuition would be okay for me. Yeah.
I
Um,
don't
yeah,
very
Professor just
personal, Ambassador Iimura.
Yes.
I think the true region in our part of the world is ASEAN +3, East Asia.
I see.
ASEAN is kind of sub-region within East Asia. But we all know the current problems. But I think we should find ways of working towards East Asia as a region, rather than just East Asia, ASEAN and ASEAN +++. And we know the problems right now. But as we go along, as time goes by, I think the ecosystem, the overall ecosystem for an East Asia regional cooperation and integration will slowly develop. Thank you, Iimura-san.
Thank you,
Well,
Professor. Okay.
Thank you very much, Yusman. It's very interesting. Well, I think Ambassador Keng raising hands. I'll be very happy to hear from him.
Okay, Ambassador Ong, it is my great pleasure to see you here. So may I invite you to the floors?
Well, thank you, Suyun. I wanted to make a few comments about this particular point concerning the AOIP and PRC's position. And then what happened recently between President Xi and President Jokowi in Beijing. I made some inquiry after our afternoon discussion. And I was told that the translation in Chinese refer to the ASEAN agreement. This is the following the ASEAN-China summit on 22nd November last year, chaired by Brunei. Brunei was the chair. And the reason why some of the analysts said there was no reference to the word Indo-Pacific or the term Indo-Pacific was at that time, the Chinese official position is to reject Indo-Pacific since it is seen as a device to contain China. So they talk about the ASEAN outlook. Instead of saying ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, they just simply talk about the ASEAN outlook. So it's up to us to interpret what China's intention really is when they did not specifically refer to the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. But the interpretation by some people is that the Chinese position on Indo-Pacific is quite resistant, quite intense. So they decided not to translate the term Indo-Pacific when they talk about the ASEAN outlook. With regard to the statement just some time ago between following the talk between China president and Indonesian president, I think at this point in time, China has to be a bit more specific with regard to Indonesia's position on substantiating or doing more for the AOIP. So it is a bilateral discussion, and the interesting thing will be to see whether tomorrow or later this week, the translation in Chinese will talk about this ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, or simply following what happened the last time. They just simply translate to talk about the ASEAN outlook concerning regional cooperation. Yeah, I think we will wait and see. If the Chinese again refuse to describe AOIP as the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, it simply means that the Chinese position has been consistent since November 2021, and this time in July 2022. They reject the description of what is being envisaged in the AOIP as Indo-Pacific. So we wait and see, Iimura-san. Overall, our discussion show that the Chinese have followed the AOIP in quite a detailed fashion, and they see the benefit of cooperating with the ASEAN side in the 4 key pillars mentioned in the AOIP. So I suppose, given Indonesia's critical role in the maritime zone of Southeast Asia, people in Beijing in the discussion cannot possibly ignore this topic of the AOIP as brought up by President Jokowi. So I would say that the actual Chinese position regarding AOIP is probably related to their objection to the term Indo-Pacific. But how this will play out in their translation of the statement between Jokowi and Xi Jinping, we wait and see. And from there, we can take a better idea of, we can have a better idea of what is involved in the whole Chinese stand on Indo-Pacific. Thank you, Suil.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ong. It was a very insightful explanations about the changing status of China's position. Now I'd like to invite again Ambassador Iimura. He just raised his hands.
I'm very sorry to take your time too much, but I just wanted to thank Ambassador Keng for his reply, and also his patience to wait until the Chinese come up with the translation of the joint press communique in English. The answer is clear, but like November last year, Chinese translation may be different. So we have to be careful, and we don't have to discuss about this kind of things in the vacuum. I agree with Ambassador Keng. But another point regarding this is this means there are 3 major economies in this region, which is China, US, and India, whose position regarding the regional economic cooperation are not clear, or they have not made up their mind. So I think this is one of the elements which gives uncertainty to the discussion regarding the future economic regionalism, regional development. And maybe this is the question that we could discuss the next time when we meet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Iimura. Now I wonder, if other panelists, have any lingering questions, and then I'd also like to encourage, our general audience, and if you do not have direct access to the Zoom webinar setting, you can add your questions, to the Q&A box. May I ask if you have any further questions? If not, I might utilize this chance, for me to ask 1 or 2 questions. I was, very impressed, by our speakers. Let me put that as a sort of optimism, because, I think I was more familiar with, more pessimistic views about, geopolitical instability and the fluctuation in the global economy. So it was, very interesting to learn about this sort of, ASEAN exceptionalism, especially the fact that ASEAN and East Asia have remained relatively robust despite what is going on in the global economy. So here are my questions. I wonder, how long ASEAN and East Asia can remain robust, especially if we consider, the rising inflation rates in the U.S. economy. This morning, I heard an NPR article, saying that the average American household, they are supposed to pay spending of $500 more every month, which is pressuring a lot of a constraint on individuals. So the current difficulties in global economy, such as the rising inflation, and then the geopolitical tensions, which are already mentioned, such as the adverse impact of the Ukraine war on the global supply chain, and then the issues of the food security. What do you think about the possibility that ASEAN and East Asia will not be subject to these kind of issues in the long-term framework? That's the question I wanted to ask you. Okay, so sure. Yeah, I'd like to start with Dr. Akrasani and then move on to Dr. Kimura.
Yes, actually, I'd like to speak a little bit more about this energy issue, energy problem, which is part of the inflation, part of the suffering that it's going to be more serious into the future. In fact, we're not that optimistic, about our analysis. If you recall what I said about the current challenges, I see problems emerging, everywhere. And I think in the presentation by Professor Kimura, at the end, he also pointed out these issues. But of course, at the beginning of our session, this month, started to say that in spite of all the problems, ASEAN was not as much affected, but it doesn't mean that it's not affected. No, what I like to explain is this. I am seeing a new situation about energy that can be serious, that we need to manage very properly. What is happening is like this. What we heard this morning from our speaker from Germany, they would resist this Russian operation in Europe, meaning that they would not, go back to buying gas from Europe. So I'm seeing what I call reconfiguration of energy distribution and supply and production. All of this would happen. What it means is that Europe, EU, would have to buy LNG from elsewhere. If they do not buy gas from the pipeline from Russia, they would have to buy LNG from elsewhere, meaning that they would compete for LNG with us, some of us, particularly Japan, Thailand included. And LNG is very difficult to service. You need to have terminal. You need to have infrastructure, to accommodate LNG imports. And that takes time to build. They cannot wait, which means that they will go back to coal, which means that this pledge about, renewable energy, carbon, all this promise will be delayed, definitely be delayed. And Russia would have to try to sell gas and oil elsewhere. They have to do that because that is their main income. So how do we accommodate? What's going to happen to in this period of the adjustment in the energy market? The prices will stay high. LNG will be expensive, very expensive. And some of us use a lot of LNG for our power production. Not all of us, but some of us do. It would affect, the whole thing, and that would make it very difficult for at least some of the country to manage the situation. So that, I think we need to really discuss the new energy structure, particularly affecting us in ASEAN, affecting us, the ASEAN plus East Asia, which rely a lot on imported energy from elsewhere. So this may be an agenda, that somebody, I think this one suggested that we should have a summit on ASEAN plus 3. And I'd like to suggest that new energy structure, new global energy structure need to be discussed. We must plan for that. I was energy minister before. I really appreciate what's happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akrasani. It is a very important suggestion for what's going on between Russia and then the European countries. Now I'd like to invite Ambassador Ong again. Oh, sorry. Could you let me start with Professor Kimura? I'm sorry.
Yes, let Kimura-san go first.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll be
sorry,
brief.
the hands
I'll be
disappeared.
brief,
So
but,
yeah, sorry.
What Dr. Naranchai talked about is the real issue, of course, and energy issues, and also some sort of a turbulence in the macroeconomy. That's another issue. But those are relatively short-run issues, and energy is a little bit not just short-run, of course, but we can adjust, I think. That's not the real problem to kill ASEAN. I think that what would kill ASEAN is the weakening of the rule-based trading regime. I think because of that, we can have investment, foreign direct investment, technology transfer, say linkage in industrial agglomeration, and then we can trade. So geopolitical tension may kill the rule-based trading regime. I think that's a real issue. And that would kill the core part of the industry in ASEAN. So that's why I think it's very important to defend that. So WTO cannot help us 100% this time. So I think the function of regional economic integration, like RCEP or CPTPP, or more important, AEC, I think that would give us as a sort of anchor for the rule-based trading regime. I think that's a real issue, and now that is threatened. So that's my view on that.
Thank you, Professor Iimura. I agree with you that the importance of a multilateral economic settings and the rule-based system cannot be emphasized enough. So I'd like to invite Ambassador Ong to comment.
Thank you, Soo-Yoon. Also, thank to Dr. Kimura. I agree with his analysis that the rules-based trading regime that ASEAN and many of the other ASEAN partners have painstakingly put together can be damaged by what is happening now. Yeah, and this is the reason why I wanted to add 2 points. Just now we talked about IPEF. IPEF is basically an American device to stay engaged with us in the ASEAN region, in the East Asian region. Hopefully they will persuade China to come in sometime in the future. But the main thing about the IPEF is not your traditional rule-based regime about market access or tariff reductions and all that. The reason why many people in Singapore support the IPEF is also because it deals with digital economy. There is no other serious initiative right now on the table to deal with the digital economy, which is now affecting all of us. All our countries are inside the digital economy. And the American planners, the strategists have seen that they have to stay in the East Asian ASEAN region because all the American companies in the technology and digital arena are going to come here because China, Japan, Korea, and ASEAN population, we are all digitally savvy. And together, we are a huge market for Chinese technology and new digital software. If the US does not come in here in some way or other, they will lose this market more and more. So for that reason alone, I think we should study this IPEF more carefully and ask ourselves, why is it proposed in this manner? What is it that the Americans are trying to do? And then from there, we take a more regional position, ASEAN +3, all individual Northeast Asian country together with ASEAN, yeah, and then we can have a stronger negotiation stance. Yeah. So this is important. Look at the strategic value of the IPEF. Don't look at it as an old-fashioned 20th century East versus West kind of trade agreement. No more. For that reason, India will be interested, because India can see that the future of Indian industry, future of Indian technology has to do with the digital economy. How can they get into it? At this moment, they turned down our ASEAN proposal for RCEP after 3 hard years of negotiation because of a political decision. So they are not interested in any other ASEAN-based mega trade agreement unless it is to do with digital economy. So how do we prepare for the Indian negotiator to come? Because they can see the reason why the rest of the world is interested in India is because of the digital potential of India, Indian market, Indian professional, Indian consumers. So this is something that ASEAN +3, we ought to think about. Maybe we should avoid or minimize the polemical and political ideological stance and think about how to engage the Indians in this whole new 21st century economic trade agenda. The second thing I want to say earlier was that in terms of the energy development, I wanted to ask Kimura-san whether there is any study about the alternative energy source in Europe. Because from my reading following the Ukraine war, which is now still going on, more and more of the people who are against the nuclear energy used in civilian sector have changed their tone. So, but Jusman, you are in Germany now. Maybe you can take the opportunity to ask the German guys. They were very, very strong against nuclear energy. But now there is, according to what I have read and talked to with certain people in Germany, there is a perceptible shift because the alternative to reliance on Russian gas and oil is safe nuclear civilian power or civilian nuclear power. And if you look at the French economy, the French energy sector, the nuclear plants, the nuclear power is a critical part of their domestic power consumption. That's why they are not so worried about this Russian cutting off of gas or oil. And if Germany wishes to stay as one of the top economy in the European Union in 10 years' time, they really have to go back to nuclear energy. So if this actually happened, what will be the impact on ASEAN? We here in ASEAN has this anti-nuclear public position, very strong. But now, even the Russians say they can make mobile, mini nuclear energy reactor. Wow. So this is something that is very critical. If the green guys are saying we will not allow us to go back to coal, what is the next alternative? Water, sun, they can't compete with the speed that the nuclear energy can provide. And very soon, in 5 years, nuclear energy can be where some of the other countries needing the power would want to have. The speed for nuclear energy development is fast. The speed for sun, solar energy, or water generated hydro or seawater converted to power, all that is going to be very slow. Yeah. So this is something that ASEAN has to worry about. If there is indeed this movement away from coal, how will be the impact on the Indonesian economy? It will be huge. Then what happens if China go all the way with nuclear power for the civilian sector? We in ASEAN will have no chance for any nuclear accident. Yeah. So these are two things that I wanted to leave for our expert to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ong. That was a great reminder of the importance of the multilateral institutions. So now I quickly ask Rocky, because I was told that we might have only 2 minutes or so, and then our interpreters will leave soon. So Rocky, are you here?
Yes, I am here.
Yeah, could we go for a few more minutes?
Sure. I think so. Sure,
Okay, all right.
definitely.
That's good to hear. So I'd like to invite Professor Kimura and then Ambassador Iimura, respectively. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just briefly, a sort of reply to Ambassador Ong Keng Yong. So in Europe, certainly in the short run, they have a shortage in energy. So in the short run, they have to do everything. So one is to go back to coal and fossil fuel. They have to do that. And also, so nuclear, still a lot of opposition in Germany too. And actually, Germany is buying electricity generated by nuclear in France. But yeah, a lot of resistance in civilian society too. So I don't think they would really go back to a sort of nuclear in a really sort of big scale. And also in the middle run and long run, actually, the green movement is actually strengthened in the Europe. So they will accelerate the sort of renewable energy more. I think that would we can see that. I understand that you don't like nuclear. That's fine.
Thank you, Professor Kimura. Now, Ambassador Iimura, I'd like to invite you to the floor.
Yeah, I just want to raise 2 points. One is what Professor Kimura just said. Actually, there's a kind of hypocrisy on the part of German. They are importing electricity from France generated by nuclear power plants. We have to know about this. That is 1 point. And secondly, we also have to know that Germany and all the other European countries are living in very severe conditions right now. They are faced to the problems, fundamental problem, existential problem to survive or die because of the war in Ukraine. So they maybe have to do something that they don't want to do.
なので、やりたくないこともやらなければいけないかもしれません。
That's second point. And yeah, as the time is limited, I would stop here.
限られているので、ここでストップしたいと思います。
Thank you, Ambassador Iimura. Now, I'd like to invite Professor Gisman for a final remark for session 3.
Closing statement from my side. For the time being, we can count on the strengthened interdependence between our economies in East Asia as a source of growth. But nobody
Professor Gisman, I think you're muted.
Okay, let me repeat. For the time being, we can count on the very strong interdependence of the economies in East Asia as a source of protection against the negative impacts of assault from outside. But we are not immune either to any external shock outside of our region. And because of that, I think it's time for us to really think about accelerating what we have in implementation and think about new ideas. And I would like to also repeat the importance of stronger cooperation in energy area and in food area. Don't forget food because food requires energy inputs a lot, and a lot of this energy comes from international market. So it's a time to really go to details how to accelerate the implementation of the many agreements that we already have in place. I agree with Narongchai. Let's focus on that rather than exploring new ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jusman. Now I'd like to invite Ambassador Iimura again. I guess this is the last session of the day one. I think we can go for a few more minutes. Thank you.
I'm very sorry about this. I'm afraid that I may be embarrassing you. But I just wanted to ask a question to Ambassador Keng regarding AOIP. Because that's the point that we have been discussing about for already several months. The AOIP was taken, initiative of AOIP was taken by ASEAN countries, particularly promoted by Indonesian government already many months ago or some years ago. And the reason why the ASEAN took initiative to propose AOIP was as many countries are trying to propose their own ideas regarding Indo-Pacific. And my understanding was in the ASEAN countries wanted to regain their own initiative regarding the future shape of Indo-Pacific. So that is why they came up, in my understanding, with the AOIP ideas. But now, already 3 years has passed since they took initiative. And now, Ambassador Keng said that he wants to wait until Chinese coming up with their own version, I mean in Chinese. But probably this is high time for ASEAN countries to regain their own initiative. Otherwise, ASEAN centrality will be gradually eroded. That is what I'm afraid of. Of course, the Ambassador Keng might have a different opinion, but this is what I'm afraid of. I should stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Iimura. Ambassador Ong, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. Would you like to respond to Ambassador Iimura's comment as a final one?
No, I think I should give the floor to Dr. Jusman. He has raised his hand. As you see his hand there. Because I think this question that Iimura-san has posed to me, we have been talking for the last one whole year. And he does not seem to appreciate the ASEAN nuances in having the AOIP. Yeah. What I have to say is a long-winded one. I think we should keep it for tomorrow because we still have a closing session tomorrow. Thank you very much, Suyin.
Thank you very much. So, Professor Jusman, I guess the hands.
Yeah, I made my intervention already. I forgot to switch off.
Thank you. Let me say this, and I was truly impressed by all of your comments and presentations. I learned a lot. Thank you very much for your active participation to session 3 from various regions of the world. So Rocky, I guess I might hand over my microphone to you as a final remark.
Thank you very much, Dr. Soo-Hyun Lee, for moderating the session. And thank you as well for all the panelists for the fruitful discussion in session 2. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we are now at the end of the first day of the conference. We will begin the second day of the conference tomorrow. And our first session, our next session, session 4, will begin promptly at 9 a.m. in the morning, Jakarta time. The topic of session 4 is on maritime cooperation. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing all of you again tomorrow morning at 9 Jakarta time in session 4.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you, everybody.
Thank you.
I wish
Good night.
everybody a good night
you.
and a good start of the day.
Very much.